Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Tech Talk with Bill Baer. My name is Dan Holm. I'm the CEO and co-founder of IT Unity, and it's my pleasure every couple of weeks to have the opportunity to spend time talking with the amazing senior technical product manager from Microsoft SharePoint team, Bill Baer, who's either above me or next to me, depending on your view. How you doing, Bill?
I'm up here. How you doing, Dan?
I'm doing great, thanks. It's wonderful to have you with us. And before we dive into today's topic, I'd like to say a special thank you not just to Bill, but to Colleago, who has come on board as the sponsor of Tech Talk with Bill Baer. Colleago, as many of you might know, is a wonderful partner in the broader SharePoint and Office 365 ecosystem, supporting mobile business solutions. And they have come on board to help ensure that we're able to bring Bill's brain to the community every couple of weeks. So wonderful to have you all with us, and look forward to sharing this topic with you. And today, Bill, we've got a topic that I remember when you first started discussing, maybe at the ESPC a year and a half ago. Was it that long ago that we started talking about it? Why don't you fill us in, because this is an exciting topic.
Yeah, I think specific to what at the time we were referring to as Codename Fort Knox. That was we had originally started to disclose a little bit of information around how we do data security late in 2014, or early in 2014, I guess you could say, with the SharePoint conference, the last of the SharePoint conferences prior to Ignite, is when we started to disclose a little bit more about how we do data security in Office 365, and added that degree of transparency. And then we talked about it in depth at SPC, is when we started to add a little bit of depth to it, and then we started to publish TechNet articles around it. And I think it's great from a customer perspective, because there is that transparency in how we handle your data and how we secure your data. And at the same time, we still have customers on premises, which, obviously is driving us to continue to SharePoint 2016 being the next iteration in the generations of SharePoint. But, beyond that, customers want to know, how can I take advantage of similar technologies, or how can I implement similar security practices with my data that replicate what you've done with Fort Knox, because it's compelling to us as a company, and there's a number of reasons as to why they would want to do so.
Well, exactly. And I've got to say, when you first proposed that this would be the topic for this week, I was a little surprised, because what you've done in Office 365 is to me, mind-blowing. And I couldn't really imagine a customer beginning to be able to create similar sorts of security configurations on-prem. So when you said, hey, let's talk about how we can bring some of that learning from the effort formerly called Fort Knox onto on-prem SharePoint, I was really excited, because I didn't really know how customers could do that. So that is today's topic, folks. And so Bill's going to spend some time talking about Fort Knox and how to achieve similar security on-prem. As always, we will follow up with a Ask Bill Anything time, so get your questions ready. Bill, why don't you take it away and give us the lowdown on what you've done in Office 365 and how we can get there.
Yeah, I think an easy way to start is think about why data security has become so important. And you look at the evolution of threats over the past decade. You can look back to 2003, 2004, and really at that time, the threat matrix consisted of stuff like Blaster, stuff like Slammer. Many of you may remember those from back in 2003, 2004. And, back then the intent was mischief, and it was largely driven by script kiddies. And then as we moved into 2005 and beyond, what started to become more prevalent was ransomware, click fraud, identity theft. And in those cases, their motive was financial gain in those particular cases. And now as we move, from 2012 and into the present, attacks have become more complex and more sophisticated. And the actors in these cases today, it's largely nation states, terror groups, and really in their cases, it is IP theft as one of their motives. Perhaps the other motive is economic. But really, if you think about the evolution of threats, it was really from mischief to economic gain to IP theft to just causing general disruption. And a lot of customers are cognizant to that these days, and they want to do what they can to protect themselves against these threats because, as the sophistication of the threats increase, so does the targeting of those threats. So you kind of have an X and Y axis, and one is sophistication and one is targeting, and you continue to see both of them grow exponentially in today's age. Just, fire up your browser, go to your favorite news site, and in all likelihood, you're going to find something related an attack. If we just look at a couple of days ago, obviously there was some technical issues, stock exchange, the initial, thoughts, that kind of ran through everybody's head was this a cyber attack? And of course it affected, the Wall Street Journal at the same time was down, and that was all preceded by the United Airlines outage. So, largely everybody kind of assumed cyber attacks in those particular cases, and it come to find out it was largely a technical issue. But at the same time, customers are more cognizant now of the potential cyber attacks and for data theft. So today we'll kind of talk a little bit about what we did with Fort Knox, which was effectively taking a bunch of technologies and pulling them there to provide file encryption at rest. So taking advantage of blobs to provide unlimited storage growth, but at the same time an unprecedented level of protection. So if you think about OneDrive for Business and SharePoint Online, they've been migrated to blob storage, and the way that we secure it is all of your content's secured, your blobs, with multiple keys, and then it's distributed across our data centers. And then each file is broken into one or more chunks to file. Those individual chunks are then encrypted using their own unique key. So if you think about all of these chunks or shards, think shredded storage. That's an easy way to think about it. They're also randomly distributed across blob containers. So effectively now what you have is you have two layers of isolation. You have a content database as a key store. You have the individual blobs themselves that are encrypted, and then you have a separate key. So now you have three physical implementations that manage the keys associated with data that's broadly distributed across data centers, not only from a monolithic stream perspective, but also just those individual shards themselves are also distributed. So that's really, what drives our encryption at rest design. And that's something that we've recently documented on TechNet. I believe somebody posted a link to that documentation in the chat. So, today, kind of what I wanted to do is talk about how you can take advantage of, yeah.
No, go ahead.
All we wanted to talk about is how can you leverage technologies that you likely already own to achieve a similar level of security with your own content. So if you're not in Office 365 yet, it's something that's under consideration. You're still trying to rationalize your migration scenario. Perhaps you have data sensitivity concerns, corporate or regulatory compliance. You have a significant investment in customization, but there's something that precludes you from looking at Office 365, either in parcel or in wholesale. Maybe you want to implement a hybrid scenario, but at the same time, you want to take advantage of some of the same data security practices on premises, and you want to do it in a way that's cost effective, obviously. For many customers, they've already invested in SharePoint, they've perhaps invested already in Office 365, and they want to secure their data, but they want to do it in a way that maximizes ROI. So, a little bit of what we can talk about today, how you can do that, leveraging technologies that you likely already own because you're running SharePoint.
Awesome. So, Bill, I forgot to ask you this as we were preparing for this. Do you have some slides you'd like to show us or some demos, or how would you like to dive into the actual technologies that are being put in place?
I can throw some slides.
Or if you wanted to just talk.
You would like.
No, I'm fine with just talking. I just wanted to make sure that we were doing something. Yeah.
Yeah, so sure. So, so thinking about SharePoint, one of the things that I've always kind of endorsed and evangelized is taking advantage of technologies that you already own. Several years ago, I focused my attention on high availability and disaster recovery an attempt to help customers understand how they can achieve levels of redundancy using technologies that they already have. And you're running SharePoint, so obviously you're running SQL Server. So SQL Server becomes a great facility for you to start taking advantage of some of the technologies that it provides, capabilities it provides you. So in the context of disaster recovery, obviously you had a number of different options available to you. You had log shipping, you had clustering. We introduced database mirroring in 2005, and then as we moved into 2012 and beyond, always-on availability groups. So there was just a number of technologies that were available to you, and the idea is pairing those technologies together to build a robust solution. So, one of the documents that we posted in the 2010 release was around minimizing downtime during patching, and it was all by virtue of leveraging high availability and disaster recovery technologies in SQL Server, combining log shipping with something like database mirroring or always on to protect your data, so to achieve high availability plus disaster recovery at effectively no cost because you already own the technology. Similarly, you can do the same thing from a data security perspective. So if you look to your back end and start there and then work your way up the stack, you can focus first on encryption at rest, and then beyond that, you can start looking at motion or in motion. So, the way I like to guide customers through this security story is really start from the bottom and where your data is, because data is where the gain is for a bad actor. So what you want to do is reduce their potential economic gain to protect yourself. So I typically start with, you're already running SQL Server. So let's see what you have from a technology perspective that you can implement or leverage to protect your data. We talk about is transparent edition. So SQL Server editions support what we refer to as TDE. And basically what transparent data encryption is, it's defined transparent, meaning that the encryption itself is transparent, which means it's unknown to the applications that are actually accessing the database. In this case, that application being SharePoint. So the way TDE works is it encrypts data stored in either data files, log files, backup files, snapshots, tempdb, and a number of other locations. Effectively, what it provides is at rest on the disk. The challenge is without TDE or encryption. So let's say you're running SQL Server and you're not taking advantage of transparent data encryption. Your unencrypted files and your back, they all contain clear text. So that's number one right there. So a malicious actor in this case can restore or attach a database and then browse that contained area because the data is stored unencrypted, clear text in those cases. So TDE provides a mechanism or a facility through which, so if you think about what it is TDE basically it protects your at-rest data through encryption. The data is encrypted by an encryption key, and that key itself is protected by a certificate. So encryption and decryption of that data in this case, and in the case of TDE, is effectively that the encryption and decryption is stored in the database and it's transparent to any application. The application could be Exchange, the application could be SharePoint, it could be a number of applications. But basically what TDE was designed to do was really give users the ability to comply with most regulations and guidelines for their respective industries. So that kind of addresses that corporate and regulatory compliance aspect. So, generally where I start is at the bottom, work your way up. Start with TDE. So basically, you're protecting your data at rest through encryption. So now you have at-rest encryption. That data itself is encrypted by the encryption key. The encryption key itself is protected by a certificate. And then encryption and decryption of the data that's stored in that database is transparent to SharePoint. So, that's kind of the at-a-glance look. And if you start, kind of listening to what we're about TDE, it starts to sound a lot like do with Codename Fort Knox. So if you're looking at the Fort Knox documentation or the OneDrive and SharePoint Online encryption documentation that was posted in the link, you'll find is TDE starting to sound a lot like what we're able to do in Office 365. So the key benefits of starting with TDE is one, your data at rest, which includes not only your physical data pages on the disks, but also your logs and backups. So all of that clear text data is now encrypted, and that certificate is also protected. And the benefit of TDE is there's really no change to your existing applications. It's transparent for applications. So to the application, the encryption is unknown. And that's kind of the one key benefits from a TDE perspective, is that from a TDE perspective, it's unknown to the applications. The applications are unaware, which means they don't require any additional configuration to take advantage of transparent data encryption. So the beauty part is that with TDE, you get at-rest encryption, so data pages on disk and backup files. What you don't get, however, is motion. So that means data pages that are either read into memory, or data that's in transit between SharePoint and SQL Server, or data that's accessed by SharePoint. The in-motion data isn't encrypted. The beauty part is as we look forward to SQL Server 2016, one of the key announcements that the SQL Server team made at Ignite was the concept of always encrypted technology. And what always encrypted does is it advances the concept of transparent data into transparent, effectively queryable encryption. So meaning that it'll also protect your data in motion, on premises or in the cloud. So the master keys in the always encrypted technology case, they sit with the application. So there's no application changes. So it's a very transparent way in SQL Server 16 to take advantage of in-motion encryption. So if you're on SQL Server 2012, you're on SQL Server 2014, or you're on an edition that supports TDE, that's a fundamental step to providing at-rest encryption of your data. And then as you think about SQL Server 2016 and moving forward, when that's released, then you take advantage of always encrypted tech, have in-motion encryption at well. So that's kind of step one that you can protect yourself with.
Before we go to step two, there have been a couple of questions in chat just related to performance, and I'd like to get your thoughts on what kind of performance impact do TDE and always encryption put on the overall infrastructure for a service like SharePoint?
I think from a TDE perspective, the impact of TDE is actually negligible. If you think about technologies that we've introduced in SharePoint, like shredded store, absent some edge case scenarios, it's effectively negligible. It's not something that's measurable to an end user. So if you think about TDE, I know when we initially introduced transparent data encryption, there was some concern that it would have a substantial performance impact for SharePoint, and effectively, fairly true. So there is a performance impact. There's a performance impact anytime that implementing, particularly something like TDE. But again, it's negligible and it's largely unnoticed by end users. You're measuring something in nanoseconds, milliseconds. If you're adding half a millisecond to response time accessing a SharePoint page, that's not necessarily something that users are going to actually notice.
Awesome.
I'm sorry, I'm looking down at the chat right now too.
Yeah, the other sort of floating question right now is, that might be actually what you're coming to now, which is encrypting the communication channel between SharePoint and SQL with SSL or other technologies before or in addition to the always encrypted feature of SQL 2016.
Yeah, I think one of the general recommendations from a security perspective, server-to-server communications like TLS or SSL is one of the ways that you can accomplish that as well. So you can definitely encrypt communications between servers within a topology, and then obviously between the actual user themselves, environment that they're accessing. Across the internet, perhaps you can use SSL, TLS. And then, in the case of OneDrive for Business and SharePoint Online, all SSL connections are using 2048-bit keys. So you can do something similar from a user to environment aspect. And then again, between server to server communications, you can leverage TLS or SSL as well. And that's not going to give you what the next generation of SQL gives you in always encrypted technologies, but that is, another thing that you should think about. And like I said, so, kind of starting with TDE, as you see, we're already starting to form the foundation of what we're doing with Codename Fort Knox. The next step would be um, encrypting the disks themselves. So now you've taken care of the data. You've encrypted the data at rest leveraging TDE, and now you have, the disks, and that's kind of where BitLocker can come in to help facilitate some of those needs. So basically, what BitLocker does is it comes in. It's a protection feature we introduced back in, was it Windows is when we first introduced it, or Windows Vista, I believe, is when we first introduced BitLocker. And then for a short duration, you also had the option to leverage Diffuser as well. But basically, what BitLocker is, it's a protection feature. It encrypts the entire volume, and it uses advanced encryption standards encryption with a key length of 128-bit. Back in Windows 7, you could use Diffuser before Diffuser was removed. And it is designed not to protect against online attacks, but to protect against offline attacks. So this is another way of securing data. So effectively what we're doing is we're moving up from logical to physical at this point. And then again with BitLocker, the other opportunity you have is you can optionally verify integrity of the early boot components as well to ensure that the system hasn't been tampered with. So we're kind of moving our way up from the data to the volumes to them itself. So there's a number of different things that you can do. So kind of the mantra here is, if you think about the way we used to talk about high availability and disaster recovery, the same mantra applies. It's leveraging the technologies that you already have, taking advantage of investment you've already made. So the ROI for that, you have an extremely high return on investment, and the total cost of ownership is very low because you already own the technologies that you're implementing. So it's effectively starting with the logical aspects by leveraging something like transparent data encryption, securing server-to-server communications through SSL or TLS, and then moving up to the volumes themselves, leveraging BitLocker, and then extending BitLocker optionally to validate system integrity for early boot components. So as you can see, we're kind of working our way a stack. And then from a BitLocker encryption option, you can use advanced encryption standards. Yeah.
I assume once again, just to to address anyone's concerns, that the performance impact of BitLocker is again something that you're not going to be measuring at the user level.
What's that? On the BitLocker side, right?
I assume.
Right. Again, you're looking at something that's negligible.
Awesome.
Yeah, and much like any encryption, effectively you're looking at something that's negligible in respect to has to make a call out somewhere. So opening a feed with RMS obviously doesn't have the same performance characteristics as something that doesn't, particularly if the machine itself hasn't been configured for rights management and has to go through that phase of configuration, or just the aspect of identity validation takes a little bit of time. But in these cases, you're looking at something that's relatively transparent to the end users themselves. And I liked Liam's little comment in there, since we're talking about SharePoint, performances. In many cases, what are you going to do? But basically, what we've done is so if you think about Codename Fort Knox, and you read the documentation, and you start to draw a comparison to some of the other technologies that you can take advantage of, starting with TDE, you're starting to see a lot of similarities.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, isn't that exactly the vector that they believe was used to? Sorry, we have a bad delay between Seattle and Hawaii today. I was going to say, isn't that sort of the vector that they, I believe, was used to get into the OPM systems with the hack that was recently expanded with the U.S. government, wasn't it?
Themselves. And then, of course, BitLocker facilitates enterprise-level implementation. So you can use BitLocker administration and monitoring, or what we call MBAM, for IT professionals to control the BitLocker implementation across the organization. So what we've done is we've kind of taken, we started from the bottom, we're working our way up, and now let's work our way back down. So we've started with transparent data encryption as a great method through which you can protect data at rest. So those data pages on disk, log files, backup files, and then again, data pages in memory and what's occurring between SharePoint and SQL as information is accessed or as that data is accessed. Today, you can do something like SSL, you can do something like TL, but with SQL Server 2016, we're going to advance what TDE is to provide in-motion protection. And the great news is SharePoint 2016 will support SQL Server 2016. So there's a number of things that you can do to take advantage of technology similar to what we. Next thing is so we've talked about encryption keys. We've talked about certificates themselves being encrypted. Like I said, start going through the documentation, and you're going to start to be able to draw similarities between how we do it and how you can do it, looking at these key terms. The next key term is partitioning data. So, one of the things that we talk about as part of our SharePoint Online and OneDrive encryption standards is chunking. The data is chunked into one or more chunks, depending on the size of the file. So what does that sound a lot like? It sounds a lot like shredded storage. So shredded storage is something that we introduced in SharePoint Server 2013. Effectively, it was the it was the extension, or built upon what we used to classify as COBOL, or file synchronization via SOAP over HTTP. MSFSS HTTP was the protocol at the time. And in SharePoint 2010, when we introduced the COBOL protocol, it was really designed to mitigate the impact of communication between the client and the server itself. So when users were editing a Word document, as an example, what COBOL came in to do was effectively only send the delta between the client machine and the SharePoint front end. So only the delta would be transferred between the two. So it was designed for better bandwidth utilization and to mitigate the performance impact of making a lot of asynchronous changes within a document itself. So it was designed for collaborative purposes to mitigate the bandwidth overhead that was associated with updating documents by sending just the delta between the client server. The challenge with COBOL was that in order to merge the changes that were created by that user, the SharePoint machines would request a full copy of that file from the database server. It would then, in memory, coalesce the changes with the original file and then send that new file back to SQL Server. So effectively, you paid kind of a one write, two read penalty for updating documents in SharePoint in like co-authoring type scenarios. So shredded storage kind of evolved the concept of file synchronization via SOAP HTTP to provide a mechanism. It extended that concept of sending deltas from client to server to server to kind of complete that circle, that life cycle of a collaborative document. So effectively what we did is we came up with an algorithm through which we could reduce the performance penalty related to partial file uploads. We could create what we anticipated to be smoother I/O patterns, and then we could also ensure that the write cells were proportional to the size of the change. So it reduced the transactional costs of editing documents in collaborative scenarios. And we did that through departing from the concept of the storage of files as this big monolithic stream or independently addressable blobs to turning that monolithic unstructured data into chunks. So again, now it's starting to sound a lot like what we do in Office 365. Not exactly the same tech that we take advantage of, but very similar to the way that we do it. So basically, each chunk then is uniquely identified for recompiling that data into that monolithic stream to service the user requests themselves. So we changed the base schema to a certain extent. So you still had doc streams, and then you had docs to streams. And you noticed a new column called BSN, or the blob sequence number, kind of how we rationalize what a shredded scenario. So basically, if you think about the way that you can facilitate some of these data security practices that are similar to what we do with Fort Knox and Office 365, is you can start with transparent data encryption to encrypt your data. You can then up level to BitLocker to protect your volumes and to ensure integrity of components at boot. And then you can implement shredded storage to provide yet another layer of security. Now, our shredded storage goals, as I talked about, was really about reducing performance penalties. It was about smoothing I/O patterns, and it was ensuring that write costs are proportional to the size of the change. But at the end of the day, it also has a security attribute to it as well, because out of the box, we equalize a file into 64-bit or kilobit chunks. So every file, a 256K Word file, becomes 4 64K chunks or shards as we store it. Each one of those is assigned a BSN, or a blob sequence number, and we use that to rehydrate it and service an end user request. But in the database itself, it's not this monolithic entity. It's a Cobalt blob that is widely distributed across a database depending on the size of it itself. So there is a security aspect of it as well, because no longer can you just extract the unstructured data from the database as you used to be able to do in the past. So I remember in 2007, 2003, 2010, you know, when we moved to SQL Server from file storage in 2001, one of the ways that people were doing backup restore was they were attacking the database itself and extracting the blob from the data table. And what shredded storage has as a side effect is you can no longer just extract that monolithic entity from the database itself. So it does add a level of security, particularly when combined with something like TDE or something like BitLocker for encryption. So, you know, kind of the way to think about it, if you want to combine solutions and leverage BitLocker. So now you're starting top down. It's effectively, you implement BitLocker, you get volume protection, as well as integrity of the system. You take it to the next level, which is the database itself. You leverage transparent data encryption to protect your data at rest. And then you take it down one more layer to the data table. So you've gone from server to database to data table, and that's where shredded storage can come in and help facilitate those needs. And as you move into SQL Server 2016, you have always encrypted as well. So, like I said, it's basically taking advantage of technology own and putting them to the best use from a data security perspective. So, very similar to the way that we started documenting how to do HADR, you can start leveraging that from a security perspective. So that's kind of just 3 quick steps using what you already have to achieve a similar level of security as we implement M365.
Well, that's awesome information, Bill. And I assume the one piece of magic that resides up in Office 365 is the ability to then just spread those shards across multiple containers themselves. So we'll let you guys keep that as one of the key value props of security in Office 365, right?
Yeah, and I think, so one of the we do is we do very broad distribution of the individual chunks or partitions of a given file. And at the same time, the databases themselves are widely distributed. So you have levels of distribution that perhaps are unachievable on premises, but there are ways that you can facilitate a similar type scenario. So that's when you can start thinking about remote blob storage or externalization of the blobs themselves. So what you could do is you could start looking at externalization of blobs onto commodity or content addressable storage. Shredded storage is going to have an effect there as well. So now you have these you no longer have the independently addressable kind of monolithic stream that you used to have in the past. What you have is you have um,
That's awesome. And Bill, a couple of quick questions at this point, because on the data side, with the technologies you mentioned, just to clarify, it sounds to me like really you can do any of this with SharePoint 2013 and SQL Server 2012. That the only piece of what we've talked about that requires the SQL 2016 and SharePoint 2016 is the always encrypted, right? Everything else you can do now. Right. A couple of other questions about technologies and how these pieces fit together for this. First question is, we already mentioned that what SharePoint 2016 and SQL 2016 add is the always encrypted. But are we expecting any other changes to these components that we've talked about with the new version of SharePoint and SQL? For example, are there any changes that might impact us regarding chunking and or shredded storage or remote blob store? That's awesome. And Bill, just so you know, there's a whole stream of questions that I think we should probably turn into a separate tech talk about the people side of Fort Knox. Everything from administrative access to auditing and reporting to your customer lockbox that you're doing in Office 365. But we're running long, and I know people budgeted half hour for this event, and we're already seeing that some folks had to run to catch their next meeting. So let's hold those questions off for a future Tech Talk. But I have one question that's very directly related to this concept of encryption, and I'd like your thoughts on it. And that is, in the last week, since our last Tech Talk, there have been some very high-profile jabs by governments at the whole concept of encryption. David Cameron in the UK has publicly said he wants to sort of basically remove encryption of data. And then the U.S. government this week also said something. The FBI made a very public statement about how terrorist groups are going dark because of encryption. And so it seems like there's this sort of news cycle political discussion of the evils of encryption. And I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that sort of mega trend and the discussion outside of just SharePoint.
Responsibility to protect. And so you kind of have these two, you have two competing notions that are just kind of running into each other head on, that have to try to be rationalized, and it's a difficult place to be in. And like I said, that's existed with any kind of form of technology. If you think back, and it's kind of interesting because I was just kind of revisiting the 1980s yesterday, and learned some interesting things about kind of Turner Broadcasting and CNN at the time when Ronald Reagan, that attempted assassination, and how they didn't have cameras in place at the time. So they borrowed footage from NBC and others, which kind of sparked a new generation of 24/7 news cycles. And you think about the way technology comes at that, and it wasn't more decisions that affected how individuals access data. I mean, you remember the advent of the internet, concerns about its accessibility and how you can protect communications. And so you kind of see these things evolve over time. I'm not quite sure how it'll play out. There's an argument to be made on both sides. There's an aspect of privacy, there's an aspect of national security, and there has to be a middle ground to try to balance those two. And I think that's always going to be a challenge, and it's probably been a challenge forever. Long before we had social media and discussions were broad at scale and everybody could participate. They were happening. It's just we weren't as privy to what was happening, or we did find out it was happening. It was in a newspaper, weeks later, because that's just the way that news flowed at the time. And now we can watch these things play out in real time. And have a more personal involvement in it, through social media. We see it, we hear about it, we talk to our friends about it. But like I said, I don't really know how it's going to play out. But like I said, there's corporations that need to protect their data because they are increasingly becoming at risk for data theft. And then you have a government
related to this topic today,
security, and they have to figure out a way to rationalize the two.
No, I love hearing this because I know you think about this stuff all the time.
And I'm sorry, Dan. That was like
loves hearing your personal thoughts on these things, as well as your Microsoft technical thoughts on encryption that we can implement at our enterprise. So thank you so much. I don't know if there's any questions you'd like to take out of the chat before we leave, Bill. But otherwise, I would say we should definitely come back on a later Tech Talk and talk about customer lockbox and talk about administrative access and auditing and reporting. But is there anything else you want to take right now, Bill? Or any other parting comments?
Yeah, I'm kind of looking through the question. Yeah, I'm working through some of the questions. As I kind of scroll through here. It looks like there is looks like there's a few regarding the the addressing your internal users, or the threat that may be posed by users that are within your corporate network. So we've kind of talked a little bit about what happens, or how to protect data stored within your network from an actor that resides outside of the network. And it looks like most of the questions are related to auditing and security within the network itself, either as it's applicable to the users within your network, or in the Office 365 case, how we manage that security. I think a great Tech Talk then topic for the 24th would be to talk a little bit about customer lockbox, and to talk about auditing and compliance, and how we address those in Office 365.
Wonderful. I love when One Tech
well.
Talks community creates the topics for the next one. That's fantastic.
Next week.
So let's wrap this up. I know we definitely ran long, and as always, Bill, I am so grateful for your time and for all that you give the community from your seat there at Microsoft, or in this case, from your seat there at home. Hope you have a wonderful weekend, Bill, and to everyone who tuned in, thank you so much. If you've got colleagues who missed this, we will be posting the recording later today. You can get to it from the same URL that you registered for the event. So thank you guys, or just go to itunity.com and you'll find it. Thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you so much, Bill. Mahalo.
Yeah, absolutely. Mahalo, Dan.